Honestly, Mom, just find a seat in the back, okay? It's just, you wouldn't want to be overwhelmed. My daughter, my Sophia, whispered this to me with a tight, plastic smile, her eyes darting around the gleaming, white-and-gold ballroom. This was her moment, the launch of her heritage-inspired line of luxury spa products, and I was a smudge on her perfect picture. To her, I was just the old immigrant mother, with a thick accent and hands rough from a lifetime of work she'd rather forget. For 40 years, I had scrubbed floors, cleaned the houses of people just like the ones filling this room. All so she could stand on this stage in her $1,000 dress and talk about a heritage she was too ashamed to live. Every brick of this empire she built was mortared with my sweat and sacrifice, and my reward was to be hidden like a dirty secret. I looked at the beautiful, successful woman she had become, a stranger who wore my features, but had none of my heart, and felt a cold, quiet rage settle in my bones. This wasn't just about a forgotten birthday. It was about a forgotten life. My life. As she turned her back on me, adjusting the microphone, I watched the caterers bring out the final tray of her signature spicy wellness elixir, the centerpiece of her brand. And I smiled. The trap was set. Then, a sudden, sharp gasp cut through the polite murmur of the crowd. A well-known influencer, a woman whose picture was all over Sophia's social media, clutched her stomach, her face a mask of pale green horror. Her champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor. The sound was like a gunshot, silencing the entire room. Every head turned, one by one, like dominoes falling in a sickeningly slow cascade. Other guests began to shift, their faces twisting in discomfort and dawning panic. A low rumble of confused, agonized moans began to swell. I saw the pure, uncomprehending terror in Sophia's eyes as she stared at the chaos erupting before her. She had no idea what was happening, no clue as to the source of this sudden, violent affliction that was gutting her perfect evening. But I did. How could this be happening? How could her flawless event, her meticulously planned triumph, be dissolving into a scene of gastrointestinal horror right before her investors' eyes? My mind went back in time, back to a quiet kitchen 3 weeks ago, the air thick with the smell of cinnamon and loneliness. It was my 60th birthday. I had spent 2 days making my own cake, a tres leches just like my mother used to make. The house was quiet, waiting for a call that I knew, deep down, might not come. When the phone finally rang, Sophia's voice was breezy, distant. "Oh, Mom, happy birthday. Listen, I am so sorry, I can't make it. I have this last-minute wellness retreat in the Hamptons. It's for the brand. You understand?" I did understand. I understood that her brand, her image, her new life, had no room for me. I looked at the single candle flickering on the cake I had baked for myself and blew it out. As the smoke curled into the air, a promise formed in my heart. This would be the last birthday she forgot. It would be the last time my love was treated as disposable. She wanted a spicy brand inspired by her heritage. I would give her a taste of the real thing. I spent that night alone in my kitchen, the uneaten birthday cake a monument to my daughter's neglect. The silence of my small apartment felt heavier than ever, each tick of the clock a reminder of how completely I had been erased from her life. It wasn't just the birthday, it was the culmination of 1,000 small cuts, a lifetime of being pushed aside so she could climb higher. The grief was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. I felt like a ghost in my own life, a foundation that was now buried and forgotten beneath the towering structure of her success. This was the bottom, the absolute pit of despair, where a mother realizes she has given everything and is now worth nothing to the one person she gave it all for. And in that pit, something cold and hard began to crystallize. It wasn't anger, not at first. It was clarity. A stark, unforgiving understanding that the language of love I had spoken my entire life, the language of sacrifice, of homemade cakes, of waiting by the phone, was one she no longer understood. She spoke a new dialect now, the language of disruption and viral moments and curated authenticity. She had built her empire on the idea of our heritage, on the spice of our culture, all while sanitizing the very woman who embodied it. The next morning, I woke not with sorrow, but with a chilling sense of purpose. The tres leches cake was still on the counter, the creamy topping now weeping a little, a sweet, milky ruin. I picked up the whole platter and, without a flicker of hesitation, carried it to the trash. The heavy, wet thud it made was the sound of a door slamming shut. That was when the plan began to form, not as a furious impulse, but as a meticulous recipe. I remembered the stories my own mother told me, the old remedies and the warnings that came with them. She spoke of a small, unassuming pepper, the chiltepin asterisk, a wild thing that grew in the harsh desert. A single one can wake the dead, she'd say, a twinkle in her eye, but 3 ground fine and steeped can make a man wish he were dead. It is a purge, a reset for the spirit, but only for those strong enough to bear it. It took me a week of phone calls to old contacts from a community I'd left behind, my Spanish rusty but still serviceable. I finally found an elderly woman, a cousin of a cousin, who still harvested them wild in Arizona. She mailed me a small, unmarked brown envelope. Inside, nestled like tiny, desiccated scorpions, were the chiltepins. They smelled of dust and pure, concentrated fire. The preparation was a sacred, secret ritual. I put on my best apron, the one Sophia bought me from some overpriced home goods store years ago, a final, ironic touch. I ground the peppers in my Malkajit asterisk, the volcanic stone mortar that had been my mother's. The sound of the pestle grinding against the stone was a prayer, a curse, a lament. The air filled with an intensely aromatic, sneeze-inducing powder, a scent that was both familiar and alien. This was not the friendly heat of a jalapeno. This was something ancient and medicinal, a feral, cleansing burn. I infused the powder into a small bottle of artisanal avocado oil, the kind Sophia's brand sold for $28 a pop. I chose it specifically. I let it steep for days, shaking it occasionally, watching the clear green oil turn a sinister, cloudy amber. The day before her launch, I carefully strained it, leaving no trace of the pepper itself, just the potent, invisible essence of my revenge. Getting into the venue was surprisingly easy. I wore the one good dress I owned, a simple black sheath I'd worn to her college graduation. I looked like what I was, a mother. Proud and out of place. The party was a symphony of everything Sophia had become: glass, chrome, and beautiful, empty people. I saw her, a radiant queen, holding court, and for a moment my resolve wavered. The sight of my little girl, so successful, so bright, almost broke the cold shell around my heart, almost. Then I remembered the silence of my kitchen, the single unblown-out candle, the breezy tone of her voice on the phone. You understand? No one noticed the sad-looking older woman hovering near the pass. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but my hands were steady. The small, elegant bottle of infused oil was a cool weight in my clutch. The moment came when a platter of delicate bruschetta was being finished with a drizzle of oil. The chef turned his back for a split second, shouting at a sous chef about the timing of the scallops. It was the work of a heartbeat, a tilt of my wrist, a generous glug of my special infusion over the perfect artisanal bread. I melted back into the party, my mission complete. And now, standing here, watching the dominoes fall, I feel nothing, no triumph, no guilt, just a hollow, echoing stillness. The low rumble of agonized moans swells into a cacophony of retching and panicked cries. A man in a Brion suit is on his hands and knees. A woman clutches her stomach, her face a mask of greenish horror. Sophia stands frozen in the center of it all, her gaze sweeping the room with pure, uncomprehending terror until, for a single, fleeting second, it lands on me. A cold sliver of satisfaction finally pierces the void within. Our eyes lock across the chaos. I don't smile, I don't frown. I simply look back, my expression as unreadable as the stone of my asterisk Malkajit asterisk. I see the confusion in her face, the dawning, horrifying question. She doesn't know how, she doesn't know why, but in that moment, as her perfect world purges itself onto the polished concrete floor, I think, for the first time in a very long time, she finally sees me. The memory of the party, of Sophia's wide, terrified eyes, felt distant, like a story I'd read about someone else. The hollow stillness inside me was a vacuum, and into that void, the past had rushed to fill the space. The dust motes dancing in the morning sun weren't just dust, they were the ghosts of my grandmother's kitchen, the spectral aroma of roasting corn and earth. My fingers, performing the mindless task of dusting a bookshelf filled with memories she never asked about, brushed against the familiar, rough-hewn grain of the small, hand-carved wooden box. It was from my grandmother. A relic. I'd shoved it to the back, behind leather-bound books on finance and art history that belonged to a world I was supposed to pretend was mine. I hadn't opened it in years, afraid of the scent of dried earth and smoke that would whisper of a life I had bartered for this gilded cage. Holding it now felt different. The hollow stillness was a stronger foundation than the shaky performance of contentment I'd been living. I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in faded yellow cloth, the color of old parchment, was not jewelry, nor trinkets. It was a collection of rare, dried chiles from my home village, a place whose name Sophia could never pronounce correctly. They were shriveled, their vibrant reds and oranges muted by time, but their shapes were unmistakable. The twisted, sinister curl of the asterisk Chilwakal Negro asterisk, the small, deceptively plain pequin that held a fire like the sun's core, the deep crimson asterisk Costeco asterisk that carried the very flavor of the southern wind. These were peppers so potent and unique, they were once considered the sole property of healers and chefs of great renown, passed down through generations, not sold in markets. They were the colors of the sunset over our fields, the shapes of the ancient, wrinkled mountains that cradled our village. Beneath this dormant arsenal, its leather cover soft as a well-worn palm, lay my old recipe journal. I lifted it out, the weight of it profound. The pages fell open to a script that was not my own, but my grandmother's, a cryptic coded shorthand of slashes, dots, and tiny drawings of plants. A language Sophia and her friends, with their sous vide machines and liquid nitrogen, could never decipher. It was the language of the earth, of observation, of generations of women who knew that to feed was to give life, and to know ingredients was to hold the keys to it. I remembered standing on a stool, my chin barely clearing the massive asterisk, Matad asterisk, as my grandmother ground a paste of these very chiles with toasted cacao and a single, specific variety of wild oregano. The air was thick, sacred. She wasn't just making a mole. She was conducting a symphony of elements. Food is memory, asterisk, M-I-J-A, asterisk, she had said, her voice a low rumble like stones in a river. Her hands, gnarled and strong, never stopped their rhythmic grinding. It is the memory of the sun on the leaves, the taste of the rain, the strength of the soil. And some memories, she paused, looking at me with eyes that saw generations are weapons. They are the memory of hunger, of injustice, of a stolen harvest. They are the memory of a bitter truth that must be swallowed. The infused oil I'd used was a simple, elegant formula from this very journal, a base of mild arbequina oil to carry the flavor. Steeped not with garlic or herbs, but with a precise ratio of powdered asterisk chiltepin, asterisk for immediate, sharp heat, and a slower-acting potent gastrointestinal irritant derived from a specific root my people called asterisk La Purga del Hombre Blanco asterisk, the white man's purge. It was a remedy, in the right dosage, for clearing parasites. In the dosage I'd used, a weapon of mass digestion. I had not simply spiked the bruschetta. I had written a sentence in a language only my bloodline understood, and forced Sophia World to read it. They had not eaten poisoned food, they had consumed a consequence. They had ingested the memory of being overlooked, of being erased, of having your history turned into a quaint anecdote for a dinner party. Closing the journal, I looked at my hands. They were the soft, manicured hands of a society wife. But beneath the surface, in the very marrow of my bones, I felt the strength of the asterisk, matat asterisk, the patience of the slow grind. The hollow stillness was gone, replaced by a low, humming certainty. Sophia had seen me last night, a flicker of recognition in her terror, but she hadn't truly seen me at all. She had seen the ghost she helped create. The woman standing here now, holding the dormant fire of her ancestors, was someone entirely new. The first course had been served, and I was just beginning to consult the recipe. The sadness in my heart began to curdle, hardening into something sharp and focused. It was determination. The woman who cried herself to sleep over a forgotten birthday was gone, and in her place was the woman who once ran the most sought-after and feared food stall in a market of powerful vendors. Sophia had built her brand on a shallow, commercialized version of our heritage. I decided then and there that I would use the authentic, potent truth of that same heritage to dismantle her empire of lies. My grief had become fuel, and I was ready to burn her world to the ground. But a fire needs more than kindling. It needs structure, a blueprint for the burn. My grandmother's journal was that blueprint. It was not a cookbook of vengeance, as I had first thought in my rage. It was a text on consequence. Every entry, every tincture, every poultice was a lesson in balance. A root could soothe a fever or stop a heart, depending on the hand that measured it. My power, our power, was in the intention behind the measurement. I spent the next week not as a scorned wife, but as a scholar of my own bloodline. The journal became my sole companion. I learned that La Purga del Hombre Blanco was not inherently malicious. In a tea, a sliver of the root could cleanse the liver, but combined with the aggressive heat of the asterisk chiltepin asterisk, it became a violent eviction notice to the digestive system. I learned about asterisk toloch asterisk, a datura relative that could blur the lines of reality, and seam sempoxaketal, the marigold, whose vibrant petals could soothe a wound or, when distilled with certain barks, induce a vivid, prophetic dream state. This was not witchcraft. This was botany with a memory. This was science that remembered the sting of conquest. My first act of war was to reacquaint myself with my own kitchen. I dismissed the staff for a week, citing a desire for solitude. Marco, relieved by my apparent retreat into domesticity, barely noticed. He was too busy, he said, managing the fallout from Sophia's unfortunate food poisoning incident. The society pages had been merciless. I allowed myself a thin, cold smile as I chopped, ground, and infused in the blessed silence of my own home. I started with the basics, just as my grandmother had instructed in her neat script. I toasted cacao beans, not for a mole, but to grind with chilies and a specific type of cinnamon to create a blend that promoted clarity and wakefulness. I drank it every morning. The hollow stillness was indeed gone, but I would not let the new humming certainty make me reckless. Clarity was my armor. Next, I practiced with flowers. I created a simple syrup infused with lavender and orange blossom, a perfectly pleasant concoction. But in the margins, my grandmother had noted that when combined with a reduction of tart Granny Smith apples, it could, over the course of several servings, induce a state of profound suggestibility and nostalgia. I labeled the jar memory syrup and set it aside. My battlefield would not be a boardroom. It would be the dining room. My weapons would be served on porcelain, Sophia's own pier. Casa Sofia was built on a foundation of perceived authenticity. She sold a story of rustic, familial warmth, a story my own husband had financed. I would poison that story, not her guests. I would show them what real authenticity tasted like, and it would ruin them for her bland, safe imitations. The opportunity arrived with an embossed invitation. The annual charity gala for the Arts Foundation, the event of the season. Sophia would be there, of course, the newly crowned queen of elevated indigenous cuisine. Marco expected me to be on his arm, a silent, polished accessory. He had even bought me a new dress, a cold, silver sheath that felt like chainmail. "You'll be fine," he said, barely looking at me as he adjusted his tie in the foyer mirror. "Just smile and be pleasant. Everyone has forgotten about that silly bruschetta incident." In a feat of social manipulation I was quietly proud of. I had convinced the event planner, a woman who secretly loathed Sophia's pretensions, to allow me to contribute a single, signature past AHD d'oeuvre for the evening. A gesture of goodwill, I'd called it. The night of the gala, I stood in the glittering ballroom, a vision in silver. I watched as the waiters circulated with trays of Sophia's offerings, bland shrimp cocktails, overcooked beef Wellington, all of it safe, expensive, and utterly forgettable. Then my creation appeared. Small, earthenware cups holding a single, perfect seared scallop, resting on a pool of vibrant green salsa verde asterisk. It was not the tame tomatillo-based sauce Sophia might serve. This was salsa verde, cruda amplified. I had pulverized fresh green chilies, tomatillos, cilantro, and a generous amount of papalaquolite that sharp, cleansing herb that tasted like the very soul of the market. But the true agent was in the Phoenicia few drops of the memory syrup, which I had reduced and blended with the juice of those specific Granny Smith apples. I took a glass of champagne and watched. I saw a powerful gallery owner, a man known for his ruthless acquisitions, take a bite. His eyes, usually so hard and calculating, went distant. He turned to his wife, a woman he was rumored to ignore, and whispered something that made her blush and grasp his arm. I saw a society matron, her face a mask of Botox, eat one, and then, inexplicably, a single tear trace a path through her powder. She looked lost, as if searching for a scent on the air she hadn't encountered in 50 years. They weren't sick. They were remembering. They were feeling a pang of something real, something primal and uncommercialized. It was a flavor that bypassed the palate and went straight to the soul. Sophia, holding court near the champagne fountain, noticed the shift. She saw people savoring my canapé with a reverence her food never received. Her smile tightened, a crack in her carefully constructed facade. Her eyes scanned the room and found mine. This time, there was no flicker of terror. There was cold, dawning comprehension. She saw me now, not the ghost she created, but the architect. The first course had been a warning shot, a blunt instrument. This, the second course, was a surgical strike. I held her gaze, took a slow sip of my champagne, and let the ghost of a real smile touch my lips. The appetizers were over. It was time to plan the main course. The blueprint for my revenge was no longer sketched in the abstract fury of a wronged mother. It was a technical schematic, drafted in the cold light of data. I became a student of my own daughter, a ghost in the machine of her burgeoning empire. The hushed, dusty sanctity of the public library became my war room. I sat for hours at a terminal, the blue glow of the screen reflecting in my glasses as I built my digital phantoms. I was gourmet_guru_87, a food historian with a discerning palate. I was Echo_of_Earth, a sustainability advocate with a sharp eye for greenwashing. I was a dozen different people, all watching Sophia. Through these avatars, I followed the shimmering trail of her success. I saw her photographed with investors whose eyes held the flat, acquisitive gleam of sharks, men who saw her not as a chef but as a lucrative brand. I analyzed the press releases for her heritage line of sauces and preserves. My stomach turning as I recognized the chemical signatures of cheap, mass-produced substitutes, where my garden's heirloom tomatoes and hand-picked spices should have been. She was selling a memory, yes, but it was a memory fabricated in a lab, a ghost with a price tag. My secret knowledge was a kind of X-ray vision, allowing me to see the profound cracks in her beautiful, brittle facade. It was through a carefully curated post by a minor lifestyle influencer that I found my stage. A blurry sneak peek photo of a gilt-edged invitation. Sophia's table, it read, invites you to a culinary gala celebrating our global expansion and final funding round. The venue was a Stark converted warehouse in the meatpacking district, the kind of place where the industrial bones of the past were polished to a high-gloss sheen to house the frivolities of the present. Perfect. The party was her coronation. The final piece of theater needed to secure the millions required to plaster her sanitized, stolen nostalgia across the globe. It was also her most profound vulnerability. A room packed with the people she needed to impress the most: the money, the press, the tastemakers. A single, well-placed dissonant note could shatter the entire symphony. I couldn't just walk in. I was a ghost, and ghosts need invitations. My target was a man named Arthur Pembroke, a bloated, self-styled culinary adventurer who wrote florid reviews for a society blog and was known for his insatiable, undiscerning appetite. He was a fixture at such events, a man who valued access over integrity. Using my gourmet_guru profile, I engaged him in a comment thread about the lost culinary traditions of the Andes. I was erudite, flattering, and subtly hinted at having connections to an exclusive underground supper club. His curiosity and his greed for a unique experience did the rest. We met at a dimly lit coffee shop. He smelled of expensive cologne and stale cigar smoke. I hear you can get a man into two exclusive affairs, I said, my voice a low whisper, my face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. I slid a thick envelope across the table. This is for your discerning perspective. There will be a +1 slot on your invitation to Sophia's table gala. You will bring me as your associate, a silent partner from Europe. You will not speak to me once we are inside. It was a significant portion of my carefully hoarded savings. The money I'd scraped together from selling the last of my Nona's silver. He looked at me, a flicker of unease in his piggy eyes. And what is your interest in the event? The night of the gala, I felt a strange, electric calm. I wore a simple, elegant black dress I'd found in a thrift store, its anonymity a weapon. My hair was styled differently, my posture altered. I was no longer the hunched, grieving woman from a small village. I was a severe, European consultant. When Arthur picked me up, he was visibly nervous. Remember, I said as we approached the blazing lights of the venue, you do not know me. Huge projections of sun-drenched fields and rustic kitchen images. I recognized from the marketing packets I'd studied cycled on the bare brick walls. Waiters circulated with geometrically perfect canapes that looked more like architecture than food. The air hummed with the sound of money and self-congratulation. And there she was, Sophia, my daughter. She stood at the center of it all, radiant in a dress the color of bone, her smile a flawless, polished thing. She was the queen of this hollow kingdom. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray and melted into the periphery. I watched the first course be served, a deconstructed gazpacho in a chilled shot glass, topped with a molecular sphere of olive oil. People sipped, nodded, made sophisticated noises. It was clever, it was soulless. Then came my moment. The waiters brought out the second course, my course. The soaps I had prepared in the frantic, focused hours before dawn. I watched, my heart, a still, cold stone in my chest, as the platters were taken up and dispersed into the crowd. O efeito se espalhou pela sala como uma onda suave. Rostos antes marcados pela ambição ou pelo tédio suavizaram-se, transformados por uma memória súbita ou uma emoção há muito adormecida. A própria atmosfera pareceu mudar. O murmúrio das conversas dando lugar a um silêncio carregado de significado, enquanto cada pessoa mergulhava em um mundo particular de assombro privado. They weren't sick. They were remembering, they were feeling a pang of something real, something primal and uncommercialized. It was a flavor that bypassed the palate and went straight to the soul. Sophia, presiding over the champagne fountain, understood the crowd's silent verdict in their reverence for my canapes. Her smile hardened. When her gaze found mine, there was no fear, only a cold, stark realization of the rival she had manufactured now orchestrating her downfall. I met her stare, sipped my champagne, and savored the quiet shift in our war. The first course was complete. The package from Ricardo arrived 3 days later, wrapped in unassuming brown paper and smelling faintly of damp earth and defiance. It was left not at the staff entrance, but propped against the back door of my tiny rented room, as if it had grown there overnight. My fingers trembled as I untied the rough twine. Inside, nestled in a bed of dark, moist soil from our own land, were my weapons. There were *guajes*, the dark, curved seed pods I hadn't seen since I was a girl. They looked like ancient, polished wood, but inside were the flat, bitter seeds that tasted of the desert's unyielding thirst. Next to them, a small clay pot held a tangle of *Huitlacoche*, the corn smut that Sophia's sterile kitchens would call a fungus, a blight. To me, it was a delicacy, a beautiful, grotesque gift from nature, the taste of transformation, of something glorious born from ruin. And finally, wrapped in a banana leaf, were the peppers, not the fiery habaneros or smoky chipotles one could find in any specialty store, but tiny, unassuming *chiltepines*. Ricardo had included a note, scrawled on a piece of feed bag, "Cuidado con estas, prima. The smallest bite holds the sun's fury and the scorpion's sting. They are pure consequence." I volunteered for the most undesirable tasks, the ones that kept me in the cold. Tiled scullery away from the main kitchen's heat. I sorted through buckets of fish heads and skeletons for stock, my hands moving with a purpose the others mistook for drudgery. I separated the livers and hearts from the plump, organic chickens, the offal destined for the bin. To them, it was waste. To me, it was the essence, the unvarnished truth of the animal. I worked in the stolen moments, in the dead hours between the lunch service rush and the evening's meticulous prep. I became a ghost in the machine of Sophia's empire, a secret heartbeat thrumming beneath the polished stainless steel. In a hidden corner of the walk-in cooler, behind a crate of overpriced microgreens, I kept my contraband ingredients. The main course, I decided, would be a *mole, but not the rich, complex, celebratory mole of her cookbooks. This would be a *mole de panza, a tripe stew. It was a peasant dish, a defiantly humble and visceral meal. It was everything Sophia's food was not. Tough, demanding time and patience to become tender, unphotogenic, and profoundly unapologetically real. Late one night, alone in the silent kitchen, I cleaned the tripe with a meticulous care that was an act of reverence, scrubbing away the physical and metaphorical grime of its origins. I built my broth in a small, heavy pot I'd smuggled from my room using the fish bones and chicken backs I'd salvaged. Into this golden liquid, I added the tripe, the *guaj* seeds, their bitterness, a grounding note, and a single, finely minced *chiltepin. The pepper was not for heat, not in the way one usually understands it. It was a key, a catalyst. Its fire was meant to unlock memory, to sear through the numbness. For hours it simmered, the scent evolving from something raw and challenging into a deep, earthy, almost funky perfume. It was the smell of my grandmother's kitchen on a winter morning of hard work and shared warmth. In the final hour, I stirred in the Huitlacoche*, its inky blackness staining the stew, making it look like a night sky had fallen into the pot. It lent a smoky, fungal depth, the taste of resilience. I tasted it. The first spoonful was a shock. It was bitter, earthy, spicy, and deeply metallic from the offal. It was challenging, it was honest. And then, as the flavors settled, something else emerged. A profound, almost heartbreaking sense of nourishment. It didn't taste like luxury, it tasted like survival. It tasted like coming home after a long, hard day to a meal that truly fed you. The night of the gala, a charity event for some contemporary art foundation Sophia was championing, The air was thick with the same cloying perfume of wealth and self-congratulations. I watched from the service corridor as her first courses went out towers of geometric vegetables. Foams that evaporated on the tongue, a dish that involved smoke trapped under a glass cloche. It was performance art. The guests ate it with their eyes, their phones, their need to be seen. Then my stew was served. Not in her delicate custom-made porcelain, but in the simple, heavy clay bowls I had insisted on, another authentic touch Sophia's publicist had loved. The waiters moved through the crowd, their faces slightly pinched at the unfamiliar, pungent aroma. I watched a tech billionaire, a man who spoke in algorithms and disruption, take a hesitant bite. He chewed, his brow furrowed. He put his spoon down. For a long moment, he stared into the depths of the bowl, and I saw his shoulders, usually held so high with the invincibility of new money, slump. He looked, for the first time all evening, tired, human. I saw a famous actress, her smile a permanent, polished fixture, eat a piece of the tripe. Her jaw worked, and her carefully curated expression softened into something unreadable and raw. She looked down at her own hands, as if seeing the calluses and scars of a life lived before fame for the very first time. They weren't just remembering childhoods they never had. They were tasting the struggle their money had insulated them from. They were tasting the gritty, unbeautified truth of a life that wasn't curated. It was a confrontation. Sophia was standing by her throne-like chair at the head table. She took a single, small bite, her movements rigid. She didn't look around at her guests. She didn't need to. She could feel the change in the room's atmosphere, the shift from light chatter to a heavier, more introspective silence. Her face, usually a mask of serene control, was pale. She placed her spoon down with a sharp, precise click that cut through the murmur. Her eyes lifted, scanning, hunting. They found me in the shadows of the doorway. This time, there was no confusion, no dawning comprehension. There was only a pure, undiluted hatred. She knew this wasn't an accident or a fluke. This was a systematic dismantling. The ghost wasn't just walking the halls. It was cooking in her kitchen, poisoning her perfect world with the truth she had spent a lifetime burying. The main course was served, and the real hunger in the room was just beginning to awaken. With Ricardo's help, I acquired what I needed. My first move was subtle. I created an anonymous food blog called The Ancestors' Kitchen. I began writing articles about the bastardization of traditional cuisine, using my deep knowledge to expose the chemical inferiority of commercial ingredients. My first major post was a chemical and historical breakdown of a pepper very similar to the one Sophia was branding as her own, explaining how the authentic version had a unique interaction with dairy and alcohol. The blog post, precise and devastatingly knowledgeable, was shared among a small circle of elite food critics, creating a whisper of doubt about the authenticity of New Age heritage brands. But that was just the prelude, the distant rumble of thunder before the storm. The main event was always going to be here, in this gilded cage. Watching Sophia's gaze lock onto mine from across the room, a shard of pure ice in the suddenly warm and heavy air, I knew the prelude was over. The silence was no longer just introspective, it was accusatory, it was a held breath. A man near me, a tech billionaire whose face was usually a placid lake of supreme confidence, pushed his bowl away, a small, almost imperceptible tremor in his hand. He reached for his wineglass, a heavily oaked Chardonnay, meant to complement the delicate non-existent flavors of the soup Sophia had intended to serve. He took a large gulp, and then another. I watched, my own breath caught in my throat as a faint, rosy flush began to creep up his neck. It wasn't the flush of alcohol, it was a bloom of heat. A subtle histamine reaction to the specific compound in the *Pimenta da terra*. I had used, a compound that when combined with the tannins in oak-aged wine created a gentle, warming mimicry of a mild allergic response. It was harmless, a fleeting discomfort. But for a man who curated his biology as meticulously as his stock portfolio, it was a crack in the foundation. He patted his forehead with a linen napkin, his eyes wide with a sudden, primal confusion. This was the unique interaction my blog had only hinted at. Theory made flesh. My eyes swept back to Sophia. She had seen it too. She saw the man's discomfort. Saw the actress still staring at her hands as if they were foreign objects. Saw the industrialist's slumped shoulders. She saw her perfect evening, her narrative of effortless, purchased heritage, crumbling into a messy, emotional heap. Her hatred was a physical force, a laser point of fury aimed directly at my heart. I didn't flinch. I let it hit me. This was the sustenance I had been starving for. A server, a young woman with anxious eyes, moved to collect the industrialist's barely touched bowl. He stopped her with a hand on her wrist, a gesture so uncharacteristically intimate it was jarring. "No," he said, his voice rough. "Leave it." He was staring at the humble tripe and beans as if it were a Rosetta Stone, a key to a language he'd forgotten he ever knew. The hunger was awakening, just as I'd known it would. But it wasn't a hunger for more food. It was a hunger for the truth the food represented. It was an ache for something real in a life of exquisite artifice. The murmur that returned to the room was different, lower, more personal, punctuated by long glances and hesitant confessions. I heard snippets. Tastes like my grandmother's kitchen, the one in the old quarter before the renovation. And I haven't thought about that place in years. Thread by carefully stitched thread, the tapestries of their curated lives were coming loose. And I was the one holding the needle. Sophia finally moved. She didn't stride. She glided. A shark cutting through suddenly turbulent water. Her smile was back, but it was a terrifying thing, all teeth and no warmth, a rictus of control. She began to move from table to table, her voice a calibrated instrument of damage control. A bold choice for the palate, isn't it? I heard her say to a group of financiers, a little piece of asterisk, real asterisk history to challenge our modern sensibilities. One must never become too comfortable. You can't spin a flavor that reaches into your childhood and pulls out a ghost. She was getting closer to my position in the doorway, her path an inevitable arc drawing her toward our confrontation. I could have slipped away, faded back into the kitchen, into the shadows. But I was done with shadows. Ricardo materialized at my side, his face grim. "She knows Eva," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. "She will destroy you." Her eyes, those cold, beautiful eyes, raked over me, from my sensible shoes to my hair tucked under a server's cap. She didn't see a servant, she saw the architect of the ruin. She opened her mouth, no doubt to deliver some cutting. Polite remark designed to put me in my place and simultaneously signal her security, but before she could speak, I reached into the pocket of my apron. I pulled out a single, dried and wrinkled asterisk, Pimenta de Atara asterisk, the real one, from the seeds my mother had saved. I held it up between my thumb and forefinger, a small, ugly, unassuming thing. I didn't say a word. I just looked at her. And then I slowly, deliberately, crushed the pepper in my fist. The brittle shell cracked, releasing a faint, potent dust into the space between us. Sophia's polished composure shattered. She took an involuntary step back, a tiny, choked sound escaping her lips. It was the sound of a woman seeing her own past, her own sins, made manifest in the palm of the girl she thought she had erased. The main course was over. But my recipe was far from complete. The dessert, I knew, would be even more unforgettable. The air in the penthouse was thick with the ghosts of 100 perfumes and the cloying sweetness of success. But for a single, crystalline moment, it was just the three of us, the ghost, the queen, and the king who knew he was about to be dethroned. Sophia's retreat, that single, stumbling step back, was a seismic crack in the foundation of her world. The choked gasp that escaped her perfectly painted lips was a sound I would savor for years, a tiny, dying thing in the roar of the party. Then the mask snapped back into place, harder and more brittle than before. Her eyes, now chips of flint, darted from my clenched fist to Marco's grim face beside me. Security, she hissed. The word, a venomous thread, meant only for us, but her command was lost in the swell of the crowd. A wave of glittering people now surging toward the bar, drawn by the announcement her own assistant had just made over the microphone. If you'll all gather in the lounge, the young woman trilled, Chef Sophia has a special treat, a signature cocktail featuring her renowned elixir of life. She had called my mother's legacy, my truth, ignorant peasant superstition. Now she was about to serve its consequence in a chilled glass. Marco's hand found the small of my back, a steadying pressure. Eva, he whispered, his voice taut. This is it. The elixir, that fraudulent amber liquid, was being poured in generous glugs into a concoction of coconut cream, cachaca, and ice. They were calling it the Sereia Dorada, the Golden Mermaid. It looked innocent, decadent. A tropical dream. Sophia, having composed herself, was swept away by her sycophants, casting one last, scorching look over her shoulder at me. She thought the confrontation was over. She thought my little display with the pepper was the extent of my rebellion. She didn't understand that it was merely the first ingredient in a recipe I had been perfecting in my mind for a decade. The guests clamored for the drinks, the tall glasses passing from the bar into eager hands. Laughter bubbled up, bright and artificial. I watched, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, as the socialites and titans of industry took their first sips. Delicious. A man in a white suit declared. So unique, Sophia. You've outdone yourself. A woman echoed. For a few minutes, it was a triumph. Sophia stood at the center of it all, preening, her confidence restored. She had transformed my accusation into a marketing opportunity, and it was working. I felt a cold trickle of doubt. What if the potency was wrong? What if the dried pimenta da terra had meticulously ground into a fine, invisible powder and slipped into the elixir's decanter while the kitchen was in chaos, had lost its power? Then, I saw it. The man in the white suit stopped mid-sentence, his smile faltering. He blinked rapidly, then brought a hand to his sternum, a faint, confused frown on his face. Across the room, a woman who had been laughing suddenly fell silent, her eyes growing distant. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fire and brimstone. It was a quiet, creeping tide. The asterisk, pimenta da terra asterisk, was not about heat, not in the way a habanero is. Its power was one of memory, of truth. It was a key that unlocked the deepest, most authentic chambers of the heart. My mother used to say it could make a liar taste the ashes of his own words, or a grieving widow smell her husband's cologne one last time. In this room of curated lives and polished lies, it began to work. A powerful magazine editor, a woman known for her ruthless cutthroat persona, suddenly began to weep, softly at first, then with great heaving sobs. My dog, she mumbled to no one in particular, her voice thick with a grief she'd clearly buried for years. He used to wait for me by the door. The facade of the elite crumbled, not into chaos, but into a bizarre, collective vulnerability. Confessions spilled out, regrets, secret fears, long-forgotten childhood dreams. The Golden Mermaid wasn't a drink of celebration. It was a truth serum, revealing the fragile, lonely humans beneath the armor of wealth. And Sophia watched it all unravel. Her party, her moment of victory, was turning into a waking nightmare of raw, unmarketable humanity. She tried to smile, to gesture, to regain control, but her guests were lost in their own unlocked pasts. The air was no longer filled with networking and gossip, but with the soft sounds of crying and whispered truths. I moved through the crowd, a silent ghost at the feast of their regrets. I stopped a few feet from Sophia. Her face was a pale, horrified mask. She looked at the crying editor, at the disillusioned CEO, and finally, her wide, terrified eyes landed on me. She understood now. This was the desert. This was the unforgettable final course. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply met her gaze and let her see the reality she had tried to erase. The peasant superstition was real. The ghost was real. And her empire, built on a stolen, diluted recipe and a mountain of lies, was dissolving in a cocktail of truth, one heartbreaking, honest sip at a time. The ruin was not loud or violent. It was quiet, and it was absolute. The trap was ready to be sprung. Ricardo had sent me the Piece de Resistance, the Lagrima de Diablo, the Devil's Tear chili. It wasn't just spicy, it contained a unique alkaloid that, when combined with the specific milk proteins and enzymes in her creamy cocktail, would create a delayed, violent, and unstoppable purgative effect. It was undetectable by taste or smell. Through a local contact, I got myself a temporary job with the very catering company Sophia had hired for her party. My age and simple appearance made me invisible. They assigned me to prep work in the back, never imagining the unassuming old woman washing vegetables was a master of culinary warfare. My hands, gnarled and mapped with veins, moved with an efficiency born of 1,000 village kitchens. I scrubbed carrots and diced celery, my head bowed, my ears tuned to the frantic, polished hum of the catering staff. They were a flock of sleek blackbirds, chirping about Sophia's dress, the guest list, the astronomical cost of the ice sculptures, glistening dolphins that seemed to weep in the ambient heat of the crowded penthouse. I was a piece of furniture, a ghost in a starched white apron. They saw the stooped shoulders and the work-roughened skin, but they did not see me. The moment the first wave of guests arrived, the kitchen became a symphony of controlled panic. Plates of canapes, tiny, delicate things that looked like architectural models more than food, flew out on the arms of handsome waiters. I kept to my station by the industrial sink, my eyes occasionally flicking towards the pass-through window that offered a sliver of the main event. I saw the glitter of jewels, the flash of perfect teeth, the artful drape of silk and cashmere. I saw Sophia at the center of it all, a queen on her glass and steel throne. Her laughter a sharp, tinkling bell that cut through the murmur of the crowd. She was radiant, untouchable. For now, my task was simple. I had prepared the Lagrima de Diablo earlier, grinding the single, innocuous-looking dried pepper into a fine, crimson dust with my mortar and pestle. It now sat in a tiny, unmarked wax paper packet tucked into the cuff of my apron. I waited for the signal, for the moment the bartenders, overwhelmed, would call for backup to prep the garnishes for the signature cocktail, the Golden Mermaid. And for God's sake, wash your hands again. As I sliced off the top, I let my body block the view from the rest of the kitchen. With a practiced flick of my wrist, the wax paper packet was in my palm. I poured the devil's tear dust directly into the hollow core of the pineapple, a tiny volcano of consequence. Then, I took the small brush used for oiling herbs and stirred the invisible powder into the fruit's juicy flesh. It dissolved instantly, becoming one with the essence of the garnish. My hands did not shake. My breath remained even. This was not nerves. This was the calm of the harvest, the patience of the earth. A poison was just another ingredient, a truth waiting to be digested. I arranged the tainted pineapple fronds on a tray with the other garnishes. "Ready," I said, my voice a dry rustle. A waiter snatched the tray and disappeared into the glittering fray. I returned to my sink, to my vegetables. There was nothing left to do but wait. I watched through the window as the golden mermaids began to circulate, tall, frothy glasses adorned with my handiwork. I saw Sophia raise her own glass in a toast, her smile blinding. I saw them all drink, the editors, the CEOs, the influencers swallowing the sweet, creamy lie garnished with my bitter truth. The first change was subtle, a lull in the conversation. A man in a Brion suit, who had been loudly discussing market futures, suddenly went quiet, his eyes looking inward. Then the editor, the one with the razor-sharp bob, put her glass down with a clumsy clatter. "He used to wait for me by the door," she whispered, "and the dam broke." I left the sink and moved to the kitchen doorway, wiping my hands on my apron. I was just another servant, curious about the noise. But I was the only one who knew what I was seeing. The CEO of a tech giant, a man who had just given a speech about disruptive innovation, put his glass down and stared at his hands as if they belonged to a stranger. "My father built this company with his own 2 hands," he said, his voice quiet and hollow, "and I used these to try and build a different life entirely." It was not a call to confession, but a slow, inexorable dissolution of the lies that bound them together. Each guest was left isolated within their own crumbling facade, the gaiety of the ball now a hollow echo in a suddenly cavernous space. And Sophia watched it all unravel. Her party, her moment of victory, was turning into a waking nightmare of raw, unmarketable humanity. She tried to smile, to gesture, to regain control, but her guests were lost in their own unlocked pasts. The air was no longer filled with networking and gossip, but with the soft sounds of crying and whispered truths. I moved through the crowd, a silent ghost at the feast of their regrets. I stopped a few feet from Sophia. Her face was a pale, horrified mask. She looked at the crying editor, at the disillusioned CEO, and finally, her wide, terrified eyes landed on me. She understood now. This was the dessert. This was the unforgettable final course. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply met her gaze and let the silence between us speak the truth she had tried to bury. From the corner of my eye, I saw the tech CEO clutch his stomach, a faint green tint washing over his face. The purgative was beginning its work. The physical reaction would soon mirror the emotional one. The truth, it seemed, was a sickness they could no longer contain. I turned and walked away, back towards the kitchen, back towards the shadows. My work was done. Let them be purged. Let them be clean. The night of the party, I moved like a shadow in the bustling kitchen. The air was thick with the scent of saffron and reduced balsamic, a symphony of ambition conducted by a brigade of chefs in starched whites. They were creating edible illusions, each microgreen and gold leaf a brick in the fortress of Sophia's brand. I was there to lay the final, crumbling cornerstone. During a moment of orchestrated distraction, a dropped tray of crystal coupes that shattered like ice on the polished floor introduced a powdered, concentrated form of the devil's tear into the main batch of Sophia's elixir. It was a fine, iridescent dust, ground from the same roots my grandmother had whispered over, now weaponized for a different kind of blessing. My work done, I slipped out, changed into a simple, dignified black dress I had brought, and walked into the ballroom as a guest. The transformation was immediate and absolute. One moment I was a kitchen phantom, the next I was just another figure in the shimmering dark. My plain dress a stark contrast to the peacocks around me. I accepted a flute of champagne from a passing tray, the bubbles a bland effervescence against the memory of our potent, herbal brew. I watched as my daughter took the stage, her voice echoing with false pride, completely unaware that she was about to serve her investors and influencers a cocktail of pure humiliation. The time for confrontation was here. She spoke of legacy, of authenticity, of a connection to the earth that she had patented and packaged. Each word was a nail in the coffin of the truth, and I stood there, a silent mourner at the funeral of her own integrity. Then, the golden mermaids were served. The liquid shimmered, a beautiful lie in a delicate glass. I watched the first sips, the nods of approval, the performative delight, and then I watched the change. It didn't start with a bang, but with a sigh. A powerful editor, a woman known for her razor-sharp wit and brutal dismissals, suddenly put her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she confessed to a friend that she'd never felt loved, not truly, not since her mother passed. The confession was a crack in the dam. All around me, the polished veneers began to splinter. A venture capitalist who had built an empire on cold calculation began weeping for his estranged son. A young influencer, her face a mask of curated joy, whispered her terror of being irrelevant, of being nothing without her millions of followers. The air, once charged with avarice and ambition, grew heavy with the scent of salt and vulnerability. The Golden Mermaid wasn't a drink of celebration. It was a truth serum, revealing the fragile, lonely humans beneath the armor of wealth. And Sophia watched it all unravel. Her party, her moment of victory, was turning into a waking nightmare of raw, unmarketable humanity. She tried to smile, to gesture, to regain control, but her guests were lost in their own unlocked pasts. The air was no longer filled with networking and gossip, but with the soft sounds of crying and whispered truths. I moved through the crowd, a silent ghost at the feast of their regrets. I stopped a few feet from Sophia. Her face was a pale, horrified mask. She looked at the crying editor, at the disillusioned CEO, and finally, her wide, terrified eyes landed on me. She understood now. This was the dessert. This was the unforgettable final course. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat. I simply met her gaze and let the silence speak the truth she had tried to erase. The ghost was real. I watched as the unassailable confidence in her eyes fractured, replaced by the dawning horror of a future she could no longer control. From the corner of my eye, I saw the tech CEO clutch his stomach, a faint green tint washing over his face. The purgative was beginning its work. The physical reaction would soon mirror the emotional one. The truth, it seemed, was a sickness they could no longer contain. I turned and walked away, back towards the kitchen, back towards the shadows. My work was done. Let them be purged, let them be clean. But the kitchen was no longer a sanctuary of shadows. It was a different kind of chaos. A low moan echoed from the pantry, followed by the sound of retching. The purgative was working with brutal, democratic efficiency. Through the swinging doors, I could see the glittering ballroom transforming into a scene of grotesque comedy and profound misery. A man in a tuxedo was hunched over a potted palm, his body convulsing. A woman in a sequined gown was sprinting towards the restrooms, a hand clamped over her mouth. The beautiful people were being violently, unceremoniously, returned to their bodies, their physical distress, a perfect echo of their emotional unraveling. I walked out the service entrance into the cool, indifferent night. The air was clean, scented with salt from the distant sea. Behind me, the mansion glowed, a gilded cage now filled with the sounds of its occupants, liberation through ruin. I didn't feel triumph. I felt a deep, weary sadness, a hollowed-out space where my anger had once burned so brightly. I had wanted to show Sophia the cost of her theft, to make her see the truth she had buried. But watching her empire crumble felt less like a victory and more like a necessary, painful surgery. I walked down the long, winding driveway, the gravel crunching softly under my shoes. At the gate, I paused and looked back one last time. An ambulance, its lights flashing a silent, urgent blue, was pulling up the drive. The party was over. The reckoning had arrived, not with a whisper, but with a final, visceral heave. I turned my back on the gilded ruin and melted into the welcoming darkness. Just an old woman in a black dress, carrying the weight of a recipe that could never truly be stolen, only respected or avenged. I stood at the back of the room, invisible to Sophia, and watched it all unfold again. But this time, I didn't see a tragedy. I saw a reckoning. I saw her dismiss me to a guest, not with the sting of pain, but with the cold satisfaction of knowing her words were meaningless. I watched the green-faced influencer fall, and it was not a shock, but a cue. My plan was working with devastating precision. As the panic began to spread, I felt no fear or confusion. Only a profound sense of justice, as ancient and powerful as the earth itself. The polished marble floor, which had reflected the glittering chandeliers, now mirrored a different scene, a frantic, stumbling dance of the damned. A man clawed at his bow tie as if it were a noose, his face a mottled purple. A woman, her mascara bleeding down her cheeks in black tears, simply sank to her knees, a low guttural sound escaping her lips. The air, once thick with champagne and ambition, was now soured with the acrid tang of fear and betrayal. It was the smell of a system in violent revolt, a body expelling a poison. My gaze never left Sophia. She stood frozen near the grand piano, a statue of disbelief in a sea of chaos. Her hand, which had so gracefully held her wineglass, now gripped the edge of the instrument, her knuckles white as bone. I saw the exact moment her public relations smile shattered. It wasn't a slow fade. It was a pane of glass struck by a stone. Her eyes, wide and frantic, scanned the room not to help but to assess the damage to her brand. She was not seeing human suffering. She was seeing a ruined investment, a collapsing stock price of social capital. A server, a young man whose name I never learned, stumbled past her, his tray of canapes clattering to the floor. Sophia flinched, not in sympathy, but in disgust, as if the mess were a personal insult. This was the core of her, laid bare. She had built her empire on the illusion of effortless grace, on curated authenticity. Now, the curtain was ripped away, revealing the raw, ugly machinery of panic and physical need. Her guests were no longer admiring accessories. They were liabilities, each wretch and grown a hammer blow to the beautiful facade she had spent a lifetime constructing. I had not just poisoned their bodies, I had poisoned her image, and that, for Sophia, was a far more potent toxin. A part of me, the part that still remembered the girl who had shared secrets with me under the lemon tree, ached with a hollow pity. But the larger part, the part that had nurtured its grievance for decades, watched with a detached, almost clinical interest. This was the harvest of the seeds she had sown. She had stolen more than a recipe. She had stolen a legacy, a story woven into the very DNA of my family. She had taken something sacred and turned it into a commodity, stripping it of its soul, its context, its love. And in doing so, she had made it brittle. A thing without a soul cannot withstand a storm. I had merely summoned the weather. The sound of shattering glass pulled my attention. A man had backed into a towering ice sculpture of a swan, sending it crashing to the floor in a shower of crystalline shards and melting water. The sound seemed to break a spell. The polite, contained panic erupted into full-blown hysteria. A stampede began towards the main doors, a tangle of silk and sequins, of heaving chests and tear-streaked faces. They were like beautiful, terrified animals, suddenly caged by the very opulence they had coveted. Through the fray, my eyes met Sophia's. It was only for a second, a flicker across the collapsing room. But in that instant, I saw a dawning, terrible comprehension. It wasn't about the food, or the wine, or a simple catering error. It was about the taste. The unique, unforgettable flavor of the Sophia's ambrosia canapes that everyone had raved about. The flavor that was, and would always be, mine. Her face went slack, the color draining away to leave a mask of ashen realization. She knew it was me. The ghost she had tried to bury had not only returned, but had brought the plague with her. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I simply held her gaze, letting her see the quiet, unyielding truth in my eyes. This was the bill finally come due. This was the interest on her theft, compounded by years of silence. Then I turned. I didn't need to see any more. The symphony of ruin was reaching its crescendo without my direction. I walked away from the ballroom, my footsteps silent on the plush carpet, a lone, steady figure moving against the current of the chaos I had authored. I moved through the now deserted antechambers, past abandoned champagne flutes and forgotten purses, a phantom in my own story. The weight I carried was not the weight of guilt, but the heavy, solemn weight of a debt finally collected. I had wanted to give her a taste of her own medicine, and by God, I had. The sound of my own heels on the marble floor of the lobby was a metronome, a steady, calm beat against the dissonant symphony of panic fading behind me. I pushed through the heavy brass doors and the humid night air hit my face. A welcome shock after the sterile, chilled atmosphere of the ballroom. It was over. The seed was planted, the poison was in the soil, and the harvest of her ruin was beginning. A sleek black car, arranged by Ricardo as my final contingency, idled at the curb. I slid into the cool leather interior, the door closing with a hushed, expensive thud that sealed me away from the world I had just shattered. As the car pulled away from the curb, I allowed myself a single glance back at the glittering facade of the venue. It was no longer a monument to Sophia's success, but a gilded cage, its inhabitants writhing in a shared, undignified agony. My phone, clutched in my hand, remained dark and silent. I had turned off all notifications hours ago. I didn't need to see the digital fallout to know its shape. I could feel it, a seismic shift in the very air, a crack forming in the foundation of the perfect life she had built on my grave. The driver, a man whose discretion was part of the service, met my eyes in the rearview mirror for a fraction of a second. There was no judgment there, only a blank, professional calm. He had likely seen many things ferried away from galas and parties, but I wondered if he had ever collected a ghost before. We were halfway across the city, the lights of the skyscrapers blurring into streaks of gold, when my phone finally vibrated. Not a notification, but an actual call. The screen glowed with Ricardo's name. I answered, holding the device to my ear without speaking. "It's done." His voice was a low, satisfied rumble. "The post went live at the peak, just as we planned. My boy sent the link." Every single phone in that room lit up at once. It was quite a sight on the security feed. They had to see the artifice, the theft, the lie at the center of the beautiful, shiny brand that was Sophia's ambrosia. My blog post was the key, turning the lock on her reputation. "The post is already being picked up," Ricardo continued, the clicking of a keyboard audible in the background. "Food safety watchdogs, gossip columnists, a few serious culinary publications. They're all running with it. The Devil's Tier. It's a good name. Poetic. They have to confront the specific, terrifying biology of what they ingested." "Where are you now?" Ricardo asked, his tone shifting from strategist to something resembling concern. "Almost home," I said, looking out at the familiar, quieter streets of my neighborhood. The car was slowing, turning onto my street. "It's finished, Ricardo. Thank you. You've collected your debt." Inside my apartment, the silence was profound. I didn't turn on the lights. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water from the tap, drinking it slowly. The plain, unadulterated taste a balm. I could still feel the ghost of the ballroom's chaos, the echo of Sophia's ashen face imprinted on the back of my eyelids. I had gone to that gala to become a ghost, a specter at the feast. But I had left as something else entirely. I was the author, the architect, the final judge. I had given them all a taste of my medicine, and by God, the bill had been presented, and the interest, compounded by years of silence and stolen legacy, had been paid in full. The quiet of my apartment wasn't empty, it was peaceful. For the first time in a very long time, the silence was my own. Checkmate. The investors, clutching their stomachs, stared at Sophia with a contempt so pure it was almost beautiful. The influencers, who lived and died by their reputations, were already live-streaming the disaster, their phones trembling in their hands as they blamed her, Sophia, for poisoning them, for this grand gastrointestinal betrayal. Her brand wasn't just tainted, it was radioactive, its half-life measured in the seconds it took for a hashtag to trend. I walked through the pandemonium, a still point in the turning world of retching and rage. The cacophony was a symphony to meet the gagging, the furious whispers, the shattering of a champagne flute dropped by a fleeing waiter. I moved until I stood directly in front of her, not her simple immigrant mother. The woman who spoke with an accent and whose hands were worn from labor she could never comprehend. No, she saw the architect of her ruin. Her eyes widened, not with confusion, but with a dawning, horrifying comprehension. It was all there in that look, the stolen recipes. The condescending pats on the head, the way she'd packaged my heritage as her own rustic, marketable fantasy. She saw the ledger, and she saw that I had come to collect. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Any pronouncement would have been a diminishment, a cheapening of the moment. Instead, I just held her gaze, a silent anchor as her entire world collapsed into a mess of public shame and bodily fluids. I let her drown in the reflection of my unwavering calm. A man in a tuxedo vomited into a potted fern nearby, the sound violent and wet, and she flinched, but I did not. I was a monument. I was the final period at the end of her sentence. Then, I turned. I simply turned and walked away. My simple black dress, a stark contrast to the peacock feathers and sequins, now stained with panic. I didn't look back. The crowd, in its desperate surge for the exits, seemed to part for me. I was the source of the plague, and they, instinctively, gave me a wide berth. My heels clicked a steady, unhurried rhythm on the marble floor, a counterpoint to the stampede behind me. I collected my worn coat from the indifferent attendant who was too busy watching the spectacle to care about a lone woman leaving early. The night air outside was a slap of cold, clean reality. I drew it deep into my lungs, purging the scent of spoiled delicacies and expensive perfume. Ricardo's car was there, idling at the curb as promised. I slid into the back seat, the plush leather a world away from the rough fabric of my own couch. The driver didn't speak, and I was grateful. The city lights blurred past the window, streaks of gold and white, a river of normalcy flowing beside my singular, vengeful journey. "Where are you now?" Ricardo asked, his tone shifting from strategist to something resembling concern. "Almost home," I said, looking out at the familiar, quieter streets of my neighborhood. The car was slowing, turning onto my street. "It's finished, Ricardo. Think it." The air here smelled of damp concrete and blooming jasmine, a honest, unpretentious scent. I stood for a moment on the sidewalk, feeling the weight of the evening settle on my shoulders. It was not the crushing weight of guilt, but the heavy, solemn weight of a chapter closed. Inside my apartment, the silence was profound. I didn't turn on the lights. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water from the tap. Drinking it slowly, the plain, unadulterated taste a balm. I could still feel the ghost of the ballroom's chaos, the echo of Sophia's ashen face imprinted on the back of my eyelids. I had gone to that gala to become a ghost, a specter at the feast, but I had left as the author, the architect. The quiet of my apartment wasn't empty, it was peaceful. For the first time in a very long time, the silence was my own. I walked to the small balcony, pushing the door open to let the night in. From the third floor, I could see the flickering blue lights of televisions in other apartments. People living their small, unextraordinary lives. A dog barked in the distance. A car door slammed. This was real. What I had done tonight, that was real too. But it existed in another dimension, a glittering, grotesque bubble I had now popped. I thought of the recipes, my mother's recipes, written in her graceful, fading script on index cards, stained with oil and memory. Sophia had called them quaint. She had adapted them, elevated them with truffle oil and gold leaf, stripping them of their soul to make them palatable for a crowd that wouldn't know true comfort food if it bit them on their privileged palates. Tonight, I had given them the original. I had given them the unvarnished, potent truth of my mother's cooking, the same truth that had sustained our family through winters of want and summers of toil. Their stomachs, accustomed to artifice, had rebelled. The irony was not lost on me. A cool breeze rustled the leaves of the jasmine plant, climbing the railing. I breathed in its scent, letting it wash over me. There were no more debts to collect, no more scores to settle. The hollowness I had carried for so long was gone, not filled with something new, but simply gone. In its place was a quiet space, a clean slate. I didn't know what I would do with it, with this new, unburdened life. But for now, it was enough to stand in the dark, listening to the honest sounds of the night, the architect of my own peace. The silence in my apartment was a physical presence, a balm. Outside my quiet refuge, the first cracks were beginning to show in Sophia's meticulously constructed world. The first lawsuit had been filed, a single wolf breaking from the pack, and the whispers about the purgative party were starting to circulate, not yet a legend, but a live, sparking wire. I watched the digital storm begin to gather on the horizon, knowing the true tempest was still to come. I expected to feel a surge of something vindication, perhaps, or a residual flicker of the old anger. But there was nothing. The hollow space inside me remained clean, a vacant room swept free of ghosts. A week after the party, I found myself standing in front of the small, spare kitchen in my apartment. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking at it as a place of work, a stage for someone else's performance. It was just a kitchen. My kitchen. I opened the old recipe box, the wood smooth and dark with age. My mother's script greeted me, each card a tiny anchor to a past I had spent so long running from. I ran my fingers over the words for lentil soup with sausage, the card spattered with a rusty bloom of paprika. Sophia had called it pedestrian. She had reimagined it as a deconstructed lentil foam with chorizo dust. Served in a chilled shot glass, I remembered the weight of the heavy stock pot in my hands, the way the soup would simmer for hours. The scent of garlic and thyme seeping into the very walls of our house. A promise that no matter how cold the world outside, we were warm and fed within. I decided to make the soup. It wasn't an act of rebellion or reclamation. It was simpler than that. I was hungry, and this was what I knew how to make. The process was a meditation, chopping the onion, the celery, the carrots into a fine, even dice. Browning the sausage, the sharp, savory scent rising to greet me like an old friend. I didn't follow the recipe with the rigid precision of a chef, but with the intuitive rhythm of a daughter. A pinch more thyme. A splash of red wine because I felt like it. I let it all simmer, the lid slightly ajar, the way she always did. While it cooked, the doorbell rang. The sound was so foreign in my new solitude that I jumped. Through the peephole, I saw Leo, my former kitchen assistant from Sophia's venture. He looked younger, out of his chef's whites, nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot. I opened the door. Leo, he shoved his hands in his pockets. Look, I know things went nuclear, and I get it, I do. What Sophia did, it was messed up. But a bunch of us, the old line cooks from before she went full celebrity, we're talking about opening a place. Something small, real. No foams, no dust, no gold leaf crap. He took a breath. We were wondering if you'd want to talk about it. Be a part of it. A few months ago, it would have been everything I wanted. A chance to cook my food, my way, with a team that respected the craft. Now, it felt like an echo from a life I'd already left. I appreciate you coming, Leo, really, I said. But I'm not looking for a new kitchen. I'm done making statements. A cloud of fragrant steam enveloped my face. It was the exact scent of my childhood, of safety, of my mother's hands wiping flour on her apron. I ladled the soup into a bowl, a simple, chipped white bowl, and took it to the small table by the balcony. I ate alone, listening to the distant hum of the city. The soup was rich, deeply flavored, the lentils soft, the sausage robust. It was perfect. It was just soup, and for the first time, that was more than enough. I had spent so long fighting to prove the value of this food, of my history, that I had forgotten its fundamental purpose, to nourish, not to impress, not to shock, not to make a point, just to feed. Finishing the last spoonful, I felt a profound sense of closure. The war was over, the debt was paid. The recipes were mine again, not as weapons or artifacts, but as what they had always been, a guide back to myself. I didn't know what came next, what shape this new, unburdened life would take. But as I sat there, the warm, empty bowl in front of me, and the honest night stretching out beyond the glass, I knew I would be fine. The architect of my own peace had finally built a home she could live in. 6 months later, the Ancestors' Kitchen was no longer anonymous. It was a celebrated brand, but more importantly, it was a quiet revolution. The fame didn't feel like the blinding, frantic spotlight of my old life. It was a gentle, steady warmth, like the embers in a hearth that had been banked for the night. Partnering with Ricardo, I launched my own line of authentic, imported spices and sauces. He handled the spreadsheets and the logistics. The very things that had once been my weapons, and I handled the scent of the earth. I would open jars of *pimenta, calabresa, coloro and breathe in, approving shipments not by profit margin, but by the memories they evoked. The process was clean, honest, there were no investors to charm, no trends to anticipate. There was only the product and the story it told without needing to shout. I was featured in food magazines, celebrated for my knowledge and my story of resilience. The journalists always wanted the drama, the betrayal, the fall from grace, the triumphant return. I gave them the recipe for feijoada instead. I spoke of the way the black beans should shine, the importance of the orange slice on the side to cut through the richness. I talked about my mother's hands, not my daughter's betrayal. The narrative I found was mine to shape. The war was over, and I was no longer a general, but a cartographer, gently redrawing the map of my life to highlight the sacred places, not the battlefields. With the profits, a sum that felt both substantial and strangely secondary, I bought back my family's old land. The day I signed the papers, I drove out there alone. The small farmhouse was more of a ruin than I remembered, the roof sagging like a tired spine, the fields choked with defiant weeds. But the old jaboticaba tree was still there, its gnarled trunk a familiar face. I placed my palm against its bark, the rough texture a direct line to my childhood, to my father pointing out the first purple fruits. I didn't feel a surge of victory or a wash of bitter nostalgia. I felt a deep, settling rightness, as if a dislocated bone had finally been clicked back into its socket. This land was no longer a monument to what was lost. It was simply land again. It was potential. It was peace. I found my dignity not in revenge, but in reclaiming the identity I had sacrificed for my daughter's future. That sacrifice, I now saw, had been real and profound, but it was not a debt she owed me. It was a choice I had made. Reclaiming my identity meant releasing her from the ledger of my life. The anger, which had for so long been a kind of fuel, had burned down to a fine, soft ash. It no longer heated anything, but it enriched the soil from which I was now growing something new. One afternoon, I was in my home kitchen, testing a new batch of tempero for the sauce line. The air was thick with the holy trinity of sautéed onion, garlic, and green scent, a fragrance that was the very baseline of my being. The phone rang, an old landline I kept for business. It was a producer from a popular morning show, her voice effervescent and slick. They wanted to do a segment, a then and now story. They had, she confessed, managed to get a comment from my daughter Sophia. My hand, which had been stirring the fragrant oil, stilled. The city hummed outside my balcony, a distant, constant breath. "What did she say?" I asked, my voice surprisingly even. There was a pause, a rustle of papers. She said, "I'm glad my mother has found a way to monetize her grief." I looked at the pot on the stove, at the simple, chipped white bowl waiting on the counter. I saw the quiet truth of my life, now the nourishing soup, the reclaimed land, the honest work. I saw the architect of my own peace standing firmly in the home she had built. I smiled, a small, private thing. "Thank you for letting me know," I said. "But I'm not interested in the segment. My story isn't a then and now. It's a here and now, and here, now, I have a tempero that needs my attention." The spicy, true legacy was all around me, in the steam on my face and the rich soil of my family's land. It was in the empty bowl and the honest night I was at peace. Not because I had one, but because I had finally come home. And this time, the door was closed to the noise of the world outside.